Hello, everyone. My name is Della Luna, and I've studied with Sabrina Monarch and Kepacha. I'm here today going to talk to you about the Sabian Cymbals, the first degree of Aquarius, and the eighth wave. I do a type of astrology where I use culturally diverse archetypes and inclusive historical analysis, and I hope to bring something exciting to you today. So I'm here reporting to you all from the territory of Neptune, a land that is now called Oakland, California, in the San Francisco Bay Area. So this is a chart about when I first got the download that I would be giving this talk, and I kind of knew that this would be my message, but I didn't know how important it would be at the time. And even I've had so many things come up where I thought, man, maybe I don't have to do it, but because of what's going on in the world, I've just been every day, it just seems more and more important to speak this truth. So the Sabian symbols are pictorial images that are meant to convey a meaning, written in words. So the words describe like a very simple image, and then that image can be used to gather information about an event, in this case, an astrological event. So it was in August 2018 when Black Moon, Lilith, and Mars conjuncted first at the 0 degree, the first degree of Aquarius. And I remember astrologers talking about this as like showing us what was to come for the new world, the new age of Aquarius. I, like so many, was very excited, and I looked up the Sabian symbol for this degree. And it was a time when Chiron was in Aries, and we were talking about the healing of the masculine and the rise of the feminine. And it was a special moment when Mars had already surpassed this degree in the zodiac, but then went retrograde and came all the way back to meet Black Moon Lilith, the sign of the feminine, a symbol of the feminine at that degree. And this time we were seeing the emergence of the Me Too women movement and women starting to speak up about the injustice that has been committed and standardized in everyday activities, including work life and business agreements, engagements. The collective discussion around power dynamics and sexuality was just starting to emerge at this time. So while we were looking at this for now, in the everyday modern sense, we were also looking forward to the grand conjunction, the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction of 2020. And I have that here. So this will be December 20th of 2020. And this is after Saturn, Pluto, and the south node of the moon have danced together for the entire year in Capricorn. And so after we go through all these transformative processes, the eclipses we've just had recently, there's going to be this grand conjunction. And this is said to be heralded as the dawning of the age of Aquarius. And so, yeah. So we're in a closing of a big cycle. This cycle is relevant to all life on the planet, which I think when we look at the outer world, we can determine that, and preparing for a new cycle. So an astrology is a system of language and storytelling and mythology, and it defines how our worldview is constructed. So these standards have been weapons of colonialization. So by deconstructing and examining and recalibrating and realigning, we can create a new pathway of our culture. And by addressing the colonial dynamics, we intentionally can create a path to healing as individuals and collectively. And that is my hopes here. So the Sabian symbols were made an astrological text in 1973 by Dane Rujar, and I will get into him, talking about him a little bit later in the actual symbols, but I wanted to stay focused on this first degree. And like I said, the Sabian symbols are pictorial images. So when you look up this degree in the Sabian Cymbals book, these are the words that are written in the book. So the astrological image, the symbol is an old adobe mission in California. And the keynote goes on to say, the power inherent in all great human works to endure far beyond the workers' lifespans, that the works and the spirit of the Spanish priests who directed the building of the California missions have had a lasting influence on the development of these lands. These remain as a monument to the men who were able to make their mark upon this alien environment. I think I can stop there, but you can keep going with this text. Let's see if I want to read it all. It goes on to talk about the enduring character of human achievements ensouled by a great vision. And the symbol speaks to the projection of a noble idea in concrete forms of beauty and significance. The radiation of a civilizing power into an institution offering to primitive men the opportunity to reach a higher, more organized, productive level of activity. So that right there was what I read for the description that is supposed to, we're supposed to use to describe this new world, the new age of Aquarius. Some refer to it as the end of patriarchy. But this is a bias that shows up in our institutions and in our reference books and even in our astrology. So you can imagine, I guess I was a little disheartened to hear that this had happened in the astrological community. Not so much that it had happened, but just that this was the reference that we had to envision our new world. And I had thought that there would be maybe a bit of an uproar and that we would toss the book out or, move on, but not much came out of the discussion. So this is when I decided that I would have to step up and speak to this. So I wanted to talk about this Jupiter square Neptune, which we have Jupiter in its home sign, Neptune as well, and Pisces in its home sign for all of 2019, and talk about in terms of a grand illusion or a grand bypass that's happening. And I think this image of this cable being made is the perfect example, like the illusion of unity and symbolized by on the right-hand side here. When we look at history, for example, we might see a singular thread, but the reality is that it's many threads woven together and how they all come together as one. But the cable cannot be made without the individual threads coming together. And so my work is to honor the single threads, the individual threads, in creating the single cord of history that we use to talk about this event. So here in my naivete, this shows, I thought I could just take the words of the text from the Sabian symbol, and I thought I would make a meme, and I thought I could just cross out specific words and kind of write on it and make a meme, one of those "there, I fixed it" memes. But as soon as I set out on that journey, I saw very quickly that most of it needed to be erased, given the way the power dynamics and the way that the Spanish priests were glorified and the actions of the colonizers, and how the indigenous peoples were completely left out of the picture. What was mostly glorified was the actual structure of the buildings. So this was the beginning where I started out, and I quickly realized that I wouldn't be able just to edit the text and switch out one word for another to make it make sense. for our age of Aquarius. I had to really go deeper and look at what the California missions represented today. And now I live in California, and I imagine that a lot of people are kind of unfamiliar with the way they are now. But today, the California missions, they sit empty, just pristinely kept in waits that a tourist will visit. So rather than being monuments of progress, they actually are homage to the capitalist neoliberal system we have today. Okay, let me see. So I wanted to just show, this is an interactive map, and it just shows each land treaty, over 200 land treaties that were not dishonored in the taking of the indigenous lands. And it shows from 1776 to 1887. And I want to encourage you all to go to the map. It's an interactive map. You can actually pause it, click on it, and change the way the map looks, and actually look at the source maps from the era and see how this land became the United States of America. And if you watch this closely, you'll see that all of California went in one fell swoop. It happened very quickly. There's a link down below so you can go to this yourself. But just here, I just took some snapshots of it. The blue is showing the native tribal lands, and the top is 1810. And then by 1862, you're seeing the blue lands again as the Native American lands, and you're starting to see the emergence of the red, which is the Native American reservations. And so then 1869, by then, most of the Native American lands had been taken from them. And by 1888, you see all Native American lands had been removed and had been placed in the hands of the United States government. So I wanted to talk about the truth about the California missions. Between 1769 and 1823, the Spanish Empire established 21 missions throughout the state of California, generally along the coast. And this was due, they were facing threat from Russian fur traders coming in from Alaska, and they needed to make claims on the land. So the plan was to set up pueblos, presidios, and missions up and down the coast to guard and protect their land. A part of the plan was to also educate and Christianize the native peoples so that they could become Spanish subjects, and this would reinforce Spain's claim to the land of California. So this is a map here showing you where the 21 missions were built. There also was a road built that connected all of these, over 600 miles, all built by hand by the native people. This goes on to say that the true history of the California missions is ugly and painful. The enforced labor and slavery in general is a side of California that we do not talk about. Military forces were used to house the natives on the mission grounds, to force the people into slavery from sunrise to sunset. There was also an overseer. This is an actual picture from a tour that I went on the missions. And some of the structures have survived, and some made of wood have not survived. So here we're seeing a sign of the house that describes the mayordomo, or he was the overseer of the mission, who was in charge of the work and supervised the Indians, as you could see, their performance of their duties. But you'll notice in these signs, they don't actually talk about, they don't mention that the natives were enslaved or forced into these. So here's a cemetery from the same mission. This is an unmarked shallow grave, common unmarked graves, where many native people were placed. Here's one of the work sites, the stone thrashing floor, where as you see, Indians separated the grain either by having mules tread on it or by beating it with flails. But they, at no point in the missions do they acknowledge that this was all done by force. So here you're seeing the barracks. This is where the soldiers lived that would maintain order in the missions and supervise the work. So because of the structure of the missions, California, or I guess the Spanish Empire, was able to keep control of the lands with very few soldiers actually living on the land. So at this time, California, spanned thousands of miles, and only a few hundred soldiers lived here in California, and they were able to maintain the expansive lands. These initially started out as agricultural projects, but they then branched out into being ranches. And the land, like I said, it's hard to imagine, but these were expansive pieces of property. So they were also run by Spanish priests, which are called friars, which is, of course, mentioned in the Sabian symbol. Let's see here. So although the priests were religious, they used violence to control the natives and to force them to work. The indigenous were thought as savages, and they did not have to be treated like humans. The mission life was brutal. And there was an 86% infant mortality rate amongst the natives here. So the slave labor of the indigenous people made California a very wealthy state. And at one point, the California missions owned 1/6 of all land in California. So that's my little homage to the mission. So here we're looking, my hopes is to reorganize and try to talk about this in a way that honors what actually happened on the missions, the human involvement, and treats all humanity as equals. So I'm seeking to challenge the relationship with history and the dominant culture. So here what we're seeing is a south-oriented map, where all they've done is taking the map and used south as the orientation direction, and then they've labeled the watersheds instead of the nation boundaries, and then they're also labeled in their predominant indigenous language of that watershed. So you could see just how taking a slight change of perspective can make a story we thought we knew unrecognizable in a good way. So here's the Sabian symbol that I came up with. I had to decolonize the Sabian symbol so that I could just have hope for this new world that we're creating. And I'll just read the words. I took the words from Winona LaDuke and John Cornhollow, two famous Native American speakers and presenters. So here's what we came up with. The California Adobe Mission, once considered a symbol of civility and progress, now only holds memories of blood, cruelty, and destruction, sits abandoned. Many have been killed, and now many more rise to stand with their brothers and sisters, declaring that it is time to stop. Humankind has heard the weeping of the earth as she begs for her life. Creating the eighth fire, humanity makes a choice to defend the sacred and honor the earth. So, I was just moving on. So this is the chart of Dane Rudhyar, his birth chart, and he's actually the one, who actually wrote the book that I showed you, the astrological mandala, the Sabian Cymbals, but it's actually a book that's no longer in print. And they were originally created as a tool, a divination tool, like a deck of oracle cards, but each one holding a visual image that could allude to a particular feeling. The original Sabian symbols were actually created by Mark Edmund Jones and Elsie Wheeler, who was a mystic. And what I find interesting, what I find interesting about the story about the Sabian symbols, I guess I could go to this, the Sabian assembly chart, is that Mark Edmund Jones actually tossed out this project several times during the making of the Sabian Cymbals. And it actually took 3 decades for them to be completed. And the reason why he tossed it out is because he sensed that he was putting his own Anglo-Saxon value systems and morality, that he was imposing his upbringing on his creation, which he had intended to be neutral. So he literally stopped all work and tossed out the whole project and started it over several times. It wasn't until 1973, more than 3 decades later, when Dane Rujar picked up the information. I'm not sure if it was a book then or a deck of cards, but he picked it up and he wanted to make it more applicable to astrologers, and he wrote the book. And he's actually said to be the one who popularized the Sabian Cymbals. So I haven't gone through all of the Sabian Cymbals book. And the book is no longer in print. I have looked at it, and I can say there are more than a handful of visual symbols that use war, battles, vocabulary, like military strategy, language. For example, like using like a flag waver, declaring land ownership by means of a flag, that comes up several times in the entire Sabian Cymbals. And I'm not sure, if that was included given Mark Edmund Jones' intention in the beginning, and I'm not sure if that came from him or if it came from Rujar's interpretation of it. But at some point, this military battle, cultural domination stories got written into these Sabian Cymbals. So storytellers are builders of our world and the written word, and our story impacts what viewers have access to and how we see our world. So continuing to use this text as a reference with these expressed power dynamics perpetuates cultural erasure and reinforces the genocide. So I put this chart here, the Sabian assembly. In this chart, this is of Dane Rujar's birth chart, in an attempt to use the Pluto paradigm of evolutionary astrology to help us understand how to move forward in this process, to how we can be looking at these symbols and change the conversation, so that we're able to mark these as a place that we've been in our past, but no longer using them as the trailhead to move forward. And I'd like to then apply this same methodology to the actual astrology and reference books that we have created. And so here, looking at Dane Rujar's chart, you see he's got Mars in conjunct Pluto in a new phase. And for him, looks like in his 6th house. I got this data from another astrologer. In his 6th house, and I could see how he would be creating new works for the astrological community. I see how that would be very important to him. And he was a very prolific writer. If you look him up, you could see he may have written easily 20 books on astrology. And he actually had a huge impact on evolutionary astrology. He was one of the first to study the lunar nodes and the planetary nodes as well. And I have heard others that have, done specific research just on the life of Dane Rujar. And it is said that his awareness, he evolved as he aged, as we all do. So that his works, from later in his life, have more sensitivities and cultural awareness than his early works. So what I'm also noticing here, though, that he also has Neptune there. And I know Neptune can represent like a dissolving, and maybe a blurring, and I could see, given this configuration, I'm interpreting that Dane Rujar would understand that as times change and as we evolve as a species, that the text that we have from the past would no longer be the perfect framework to discuss our future. So that's kind of how I'm interpreting his Mars, Pluto, Neptune conjunction. And then here looking at the Sabian assembly, this was actually created by Mark Edmund Jones, and this was created before the Sabian symbols were created in 1923, but it is the institution that the Sabian symbols came out of. And what we see here is a Pluto in Cancer. And I think that the Pluto paradigm, like how we understand Pluto generationally, we know that certain things are of the past or came out of a certain element and that are falling away. And so I see this time now when we have the North Node in Cancer, opposite Pluto, that Pluto in Capricorn, that, this might be a time where we're really actually going to be healing these wounds and reorienting and not re-inflicting the wounds. So how can we move forward when let's see. So how can we signal this new era and actually evolve ourselves in our community here, this Uranian community of evolutionary astrology? How can we engage in a process of ripening and prepare for the dawning for the age of Aquarius and no longer exclude, minimize indigenous cultures and the impact they had on the earth? It has been proven that indigenous land management are found to harbor more biodiversity than our modern society's protected areas do and conservation strategies. The modern dominant culture, we rely on establishing protected areas to conserve critical habitat for biodiversity, but it has been found that this actually protects species less than the indigenous management of lands. And as we hurtle towards the age of Aquarius, this new time, we are collectively looking forward and ripening for this new age. And I encourage us to ripen actively, to engage in it. It will not come from just sitting back and not being involved in what's happening in the larger world. We do know that the patriarchy is falling, and what it will actually take is for us, all of us here listening on the call, to engage in dismantling it. I bring it up to propose the question that what do we do when we find the relics of the patriarchy written in our astrological books and references? How can we look forward? And I believe that evolutionary astrologers being into transformation, part of the ideology, and understanding the discomfort that comes naturally as a process of evolution, both on a personal level and on a collective level. I believe of all people on the planet, evolutionary astrologers are able to intentionally engage in this conversation and dialogue with one another and propose steps on a path of moving forward. I believe we can be models for the greater population. And I also believe that just taking this action today in this space will seed the collective consciousness and have a ripple of impact that we cannot measure by our human senses today. Many native cultures and tribal people there are many native cultures and tribal peoples with unique cultural practices and ways of life that live on the earth. It is a disservice to them to use a generic term such as Native American or to refer to all the unique tribal peoples and to collapse them all into one identity. I encourage you all to honor the native land that you live on, to speak by their names, to learn names, to speak of them, because they are here today. Some I learned just in doing this talk: Mohegan, Pomo, Ho-Chunk, Huichun, and Chumash. The map I showed you earlier where I'm from, in Huichun, just the small city I live in had over 20 native, indigenous, separate people and tribes. So I wanted to let you know that there is an app where you can go and look up whose land you are on. And I put that here in, it's the native-land.ca. You can go look that up. And I do encourage you to do it. It's actually becoming a tradition in the liberal circles here in California, where we always honor the land that we are on and the people who stewarded it before us. That has been the conclusion of my talk for today. If you would like to hear more about my culturally diverse archetypes and historical analysis, inclusive historical analysis, you can follow me. Like, follow, share, please, at decolonizeastrology.com. And that is it.
Thank you. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say I would love to hear other people's ideas who heard this discussion and who have any questions and or ideas on what I said.
Sure. Peggy, did you want to share what you typed in the chat?
Perhaps unmute.
Oh, there you are.
Peggy? Okay, maybe not.
That was Dawn.
Yeah, I know. Peggy, yes. Peggy, can you please unmute? Here she is. Great.
Oh, good.
Go ahead, Peggy. I don't have a voice. Oh, okay. Okay, well, I'll read it out. Okay. Peggy is sharing an inner interpretation which speaks to one's soul. She says, adobe bricks are made of the clay of the earth and are baked, strengthened by the sun, divine consciousness. Thus, one's physical and spiritual natures are combined to construct a mission to serve a divine purpose, having a civilizing and spiritual influence upon one's natural but developing state, California. This combined mission of body and spirit has endured. Collectively, I can see where this mission would be appropriate for the coming Aquarian age. And that was Peggy's comment. Anything that you'd like to respond to there, Della?
Yes, well, I can say that the California missions is a mandatory part of the 4th grade curriculum here in California, which means it's mandatory for every 4th grade student to do certain activities and to also visit the missions. But there also is a huge critique of the curriculum because, like what you saw at the now modern museums and the signage that you saw, where the actual lives and impact made by the indigenous people is not mentioned at all. And I think, while I do understand where you're coming from, making that statement, I can say that it is a bigger conversation around how we discuss and talk about these things. And so if the same symbol had even mentioned the Native Americans and not just the Spanish priests, or had championed like all of their efforts that went into building each adobe brick, and also the servitude that they put in towards their overseers, I could see that it definitely could be incorporated in that way.
Okay, and Peggy has responded in the chat. She says, I don't take the California mission literally. I see it as a symbol of one's inner self.
Which I think is interesting and fascinating. But one of the critiques of all learning around the mission is that they focus on, manifest destiny and a divine mission rather than an accurate history lesson. And most of the information is comprised by the dominant culture and focuses on the building structures themselves rather than the actual experience of life on the missions. And so when I say that this is a controversy in California, especially around the fourth grade curriculums, I'm talking about the indigenous tribes and the native elders today have put in a bill to Governor Newsom to actually get the curriculums altered to actually mention their people and not have them erased from the history. So I feel like that analogy would really only work if someone is a member of the dominant culture. And I don't know if, someone of a different cultural ancestry could even, well, I guess they could identify like my body, my parts are here, my lineage is here. But I do feel like there needs to be more awareness and equality, because there's been a near constant pressure to separate indigenous people from their lands and to erase them from our historical texts. And I do not believe that they should be a footnote in our history books and should not be assigned a lesser value by scholars, which has been the pattern.
Okay, well, good on you, Della. That's fantastic. Peggy says, thank you, Della. Very interesting. And do we have any final questions or comments from our audience?
Della, you might have said this earlier and I missed it. I was making dinner and a bunch of stuff. Now I forget my question. Hold on, give me a second.
Sure, take your time.
Well, I guess I'll just make a comment because my question is not really coming back. I mean, it has to do with what you just talked about getting their presence out of history books and all of that. And I mean, I'm quite a bit older than you, but I walked out of 10th grade history and said, screw this. I'm not going to sit here and listen to this because it didn't honor anything. And I was like I'm an old Native American soul. So just really, really enraged about it and never went back to class actually. But so are these different groups that you were talking about, especially in California, they're doing something to stop that process from happening?
They are in the process of, and there's many things happening in California. There's one group, the Amah tribe, which did live in the Bay Area, and they have gotten a land trust and gotten some land that they are now using to reactivate their indigenous land stewardship practices, and it's truly fascinating. So the Amah, they used fire to control the landscape. And if you can go back and read the historical text from the Spanish when they were first coming here, that they sent letters back to Spain to prepare the follow-up missions and voyages. So in the historical documents they sent back, they told the coming soldiers to bring their own firewood up to Northern California because there was no firewood to be found. And so they actually carried firewood north. And now today, when we look in California, we see an overrun of coniferous trees, which are the ones that spread fire really quickly. And so what the Amah people, they actually used fire to control the landscape. And so when they would burn the fire or place the fire, they knew exactly what would happen 1 year later. They knew which seeds would sprout. They knew which grasses would come that first year and which animals would be eating those grasses. They knew in 3 years that there would be taller, like more wheat grasses, and they knew that they could come harvest more crops from that area. And they knew then that the deer and other wildlife were eating. And then they knew like 7 years from the date that they had placed that fire, that the willows would be growing and that they could then return to come back and harvest for making their baskets. And so that's kind of what I'm speaking to when I talk about how their cultural practices have been erased. They were portrayed, I guess when it went into the history books, as they were just not doing anything, that the land was just wide open space. But they actually had a very sophisticated land management stewardship practices that maintained the grasslands here in California, which provided food, for the animals and the people. And they also, let's see, there was one more thing I was going to say about them. Yeah, they also knew that the coniferous trees were not allowed to be taller than the deciduous trees, because they knew if that would happen, that the trees would get too tall and they would make clusters and they would shade out the deciduous trees and also the grasslands. And if you look at maps of California, when you look at the amount of grasslands, wide open grasslands, especially when they, were able to feed all the cattle from the ranches, that wide open expansive ranch land doesn't exist anymore because the coniferous trees have overgrown them. And once that happens, it creates a chain reaction and it changes the soil content so that other trees and plants don't grow there. So once the coniferous plants take over, it's kind of a point of no return, or it's very difficult to reverse it. And so these are things that we're all discovering now, in our modern technology. Everyone's talking about regenerative farming. That's our Uranus and Taurus, which I didn't get to today, but I would love to talk about that and how it relates to the new world at the age of Aquarius. But I do feel like this ripening time that with the Jupiter square Neptune, there's kind of this big illusion that we kind of know what's going on. And we might hear, oh, regenerative farming, that's great. But at the same time, regenerative farming is just the new dominant culture's way of discussing and reclaiming the indigenous land stewardship practices. So I do feel like the conversation should really be about restoring indigenous land rights and not so much about our modern culture defining what progress is.
Right. It's like talking about Pluto, Capricorn, dark Eros, right? And the toxic patriarchy or the negative patriarchy, just, it's like reorganizing things, but nothing's really different.
True.
But we are on the verge, as you shared, and it looks bad. It looks really bad. But I think, we are on the verge of a whole new way. Yeah. And the only way we're really going to heal is to reinvite or give back what was taken so that we can actually receive the true healing on every level, right? The land, the people, the
exactly.
water,
and I feel like
all that.
And I feel like our evolutionary astrology community, we know about the process of transformation and the discomfort that can bring. And so I feel like our little community, I don't know how little we are, but our community can really have these conversations. And if anyone has any ideas as to how we can move forward, having, these texts from the past, from the grandfathers of astrology, of modern astrology. And I know we're talking about maybe the word is matriarchy. There's a word.
Yeah.
Yeah. How can we hold on to this as a place where we've been, but also move forward without recreating these same dynamics in our spaces?
Yeah. Right. I remember my question. So do you know who Marianne Williamson is?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think about her take on everything and what she's saying
in regards to?
Well, she is talking about reparations for the African Americans, but she's also talking with a lot of indigenous Native American peoples here. Anyway, it's worth checking out. She's
totally. I've heard her. I know that she does speak to it, and I think it's good that she's drawing attention to these issues. But I do know, specifically when it comes to reparations for African Americans, that her numbers are way off. And so she came up with a much smaller number in terms of what the reparations amount would be. And when we talk about Marianne Williamson and reparations, she really doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. There's been scholars that have already done the work for her. So I don't understand how she could come up with a number that actually was so low. So I think she's kind of using the reparations buzzword without really backing it up with the actual data.
Interesting.
but she's using it enough to like draw attention and to gain support for herself. That I will say. And I think it's
right. I don't know that it's just about, maybe. I mean, it's hard to trust people, right? Especially politicians.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But if her numbers were spot on and matched what all the experts said, I would really support her. But since they don't, I'm very.
It'd be interesting to ask her, though. You could ask them directly. You know.
Yeah.
Why are these numbers this way?
Exactly. Yeah, and it's actually pretty famous. Ta-Nehisi Coates, he put out a really good study on the reparations. So the numbers are out there and readily available for Marianne Williamson. I hope she looks them up.
Interesting. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Della, well, that brings us to the end of your meeting. Thank you so much for making so many really good points. And it's certainly great food for thought at this time. So would you all please unmute and thank Della Luna?
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll catch you next time, Della. Thank you. Bye for now.
Bye.